New York City, in the early decades of the 20th century, was a place where ambition collided with desperation on every street corner. The city hummed with the restless energy of millions, a swirling mass of immigrants, dreamers, hustlers, and criminals all competing for a foothold in the chaotic promise of America. The skyline was rising, the ports were overflowing, and the night was alive with jazz, liquor, and danger. In the shadows of glowing marquees and smoky speakeasies, a parallel world existed, one built not on opportunity but on power, fear, and the unspoken rules of the underworld. And at the center of this brewing storm, emerging like a force shaped by both circumstance and ambition, stood a young man who would eventually challenge the old order and redefine the very meaning of organized crime, Charles Lucky Luciano. To understand his rise, one must first understand the world he entered, a city fractured by ethnic divisions, economic turmoil, and violent competition. The Lower East Side was one of the most densely populated places on Earth, choked with tenement buildings that housed families packed together in suffocating rooms. Streets teemed with pushcarts, factory workers, street gangs, and the marginalized souls who had fled poverty in Europe only to confront a different kind of struggle in America. For many, the promise of the New World quickly transformed into a harsh lesson. Survival required more than hard work. It required cunning. It required alliances. And for some, it required stepping into the shadows where the rules were different, and the consequences deadly. In these cramped neighborhoods, the seeds of the American Mafia had taken root long before Luciano's arrival. Sicilian immigrants carried with them memories of secret societies, violent codes, and traditions built around honor and retaliation. These customs, transplanted into the cauldron of American urban life, clashed and merged with the realities of New York's criminal economy. Street gangs fought turf wars with fists, knives, and clubs. Extortion rings preyed on vulnerable business owners. And criminal bosses, men who believed themselves untouchable, ruled their territories like miniature kingdoms. It was not a world for the faint-hearted. Amid this volatile environment, whispers of larger conflicts continued to grow. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, had inadvertently created one of the most profitable black markets in history. Alcohol, outlawed by the government, became the commodity that fueled an underground economy worth millions. Speakeasies flourished, bootleggers became rich overnight, and gangsters who had once engaged in small-time rackets suddenly found themselves managing vast distribution networks that spanned states and involved corrupt politicians, police officers, and businessmen. Crime became organized not by design but by necessity. And in this shifting landscape, the men who could adapt quickly, those who could see the hidden opportunities, rose to unprecedented heights. But even as the criminal world expanded, it remained deeply fractured. Old-world mobsters clung to Sicilian traditions, trusting only those who shared their blood or their birthplace. Ethnic rivalries ran deep. Italians fought Irish gangs, Jewish gangs clashed with Italians, and every group carved out territories with relentless ferocity. The mafia itself was divided into countless factions, each loyal to its own leader and each unwilling to yield, even when violence threatened to destabilize the entire underworld. In this climate of chaos, vision was rare, and unity almost impossible. Into this turbulent backdrop stepped Luciano, a streetwise teenager with sharp instincts and an unusual willingness to collaborate beyond ethnic lines. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was not confined by tradition or blinded by the rigid codes of the past. The young boy who arrived from Sicily had quickly learned that survival required adaptation. And adaptation required breaking rules, sometimes the very rules that defined the culture he came from. Luciano's early years exposed him to the full spectrum of the city's underbelly, the petty hustles, the violent confrontations, the subtle politics of the street. He joined gangs, made allies, crossed ethnic boundaries, and built a reputation that blended intimidation with charisma. Long before he became a powerful figure, his name circulated among young criminals as someone who possessed a rare combination of courage and intelligence. Yet his ascent was not inevitable. The underworld was unforgiving, and countless young men who had exhibited similar ambition were swallowed by its dangers. But Luciano possessed something more, an uncanny ability to read people and situations, to predict outcomes before they unfolded. He understood human weakness, whether it was greed, fear, or loyalty. He knew when to show strength and when to exercise patience. And perhaps more importantly, he knew that the old mafia, with its rigid hierarchies and endless feuds, was unsustainable in the fast-paced, profit-driven world of American crime. As the 1920s progressed, prohibition continued to reshape the criminal landscape. Money flowed like water and the power struggles intensified. Violence erupted in every borough from Manhattan to Brooklyn to the Bronx. Gang leaders rose and fell with brutal efficiency, often betrayed by their closest allies. Law enforcement agencies, overwhelmed and underfunded, couldn't keep up. Corruption infected institutions at every level, from city hall to the courts to the police precincts. Judges were bought, officers were bribed, and politicians turned a blind eye as long as they received their cut. In this world, the line between legality and criminality blurred almost to invisibility. Luciano thrived in this environment. He forged alliances across ethnic groups, most notably with Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, two men whose intelligence and fearlessness complemented Luciano's own strengths. Together, they built networks that defied the old boundaries, moving liquor, managing gambling operations, and establishing a code of efficiency and profit that contrasted sharply with the emotional vendettas of older mob leaders. Where others saw only chaos, Luciano saw opportunity. The criminal world was expanding, but it lacked structure. And structure, he believed, was the key to long-term dominance. But the emergence of new power also created new enemies. Old world bosses grew increasingly suspicious of Luciano's methods, viewing his willingness to collaborate with non-Italians as a betrayal of tradition. They feared his growing influence and resented his innovative approach to criminal organization. These tensions simmered beneath the surface, feeding rivalries that would eventually explode into open conflict. Yet Luciano remained focused, carefully navigating alliances and avoiding unnecessary confrontations, at least until confrontation became inevitable. The city itself mirrored these tensions. New York was evolving at a dizzying pace, its skyscrapers rising higher, its industries expanding and its population swelling. The Roaring Twenties brought prosperity for some and crushing poverty for others. Jazz clubs, dance halls and speakeasies created a vibrant nightlife, offering escape from the hardships of daily life. But beneath the glamour, crime thrived and violence was never far away. The public was simultaneously fascinated and frightened by the underworld, drawn to stories of daring heists and bootlegging empires, yet terrified of gangland executions and street shootouts. By the time the decade came to a close, Luciano had already begun to distinguish himself from the previous generation of mobsters. He envisioned a unified criminal organization, a commission of families that would regulate disputes, standardize operations and ensure that the mafia operated as a cohesive, profitable system. But such a vision required dismantling the old structures, neutralizing rivals and challenging traditions that had defined the mafia for centuries. This ambition set the stage for conflicts that would shake the underworld to its core. The Great Depression further reshaped the landscape. As the economy collapsed and unemployment soared, desperation pushed more people into crime. Illegal enterprises grew, fueled by the need for income and the demand for cheap entertainment. Politicians relied even more heavily on criminal alliances to secure power, while law enforcement struggled to maintain order. The cracks in society widened, creating the perfect conditions for ambitious figures like Luciano to ascend even further. As rumors of Luciano's growing influence spread, fear and respect intertwined in the minds of both allies and enemies. His name carried weight in the speakeasies, backrooms and docks of New York. Some saw him as a visionary, others saw him as a threat to the old order. But all agreed on one thing: this was a man unlike the gangsters who had come before, a man whose rise was not merely a product of violence or luck, but of insight, strategy, and an unshakable belief in the future he intended to build. The world that shaped Lucky Luciano was a world of contradictions: poverty and prosperity, law and corruption, tradition and innovation. It was a crucible where ambition was forged in hardship and sharpened by danger. And from this crucible emerged a figure who would wage a war not just against rivals, but against the very structure of the old mafia. A war that would lead to the dismantling of an outdated system, and the creation of a new one that would define organized crime for generations. A war that would transform the underworld from chaos into control. A war that would mark the beginning of an empire, and the rise of the man who built it. The streets of early 20th century New York formed a battleground where survival was a daily negotiation, and a young immigrant named Charles Luciano learned these lessons faster than most. Before he became the orchestrator of a new criminal order, before his name echoed through the corridors of power and fear, he was simply another boy in the melting pot of the Lower East Side, shaped by its noise, its brutality, and its restless hunger. To understand his transformation into Lucky Luciano, one must go back to these formative years defined not by victory, but by constant struggle, observation, and an instinctive understanding of human nature that set him apart. The Lower East Side in the early 1900s was less a neighborhood and more a compressed world, overflowing with the hopes and disappointments of immigrants who had crossed oceans in search of a better life. Tenement buildings rose like grim monuments, packed with families who lived shoulder to shoulder in dim, narrow rooms where privacy was a luxury and air a privilege. The streets below were a labyrinth of pushcarts, peddlers, shouting merchants, and barefoot children darting through alleys. The scent of fish markets mixed with coal smoke, and the constant hum of movement gave the impression that the city itself never took a breath. In this environment, young boys matured quickly. Childhood was a brief, fragile phase, often replaced early with responsibility, work, or the temptations of the street. For Luciano, the transition was swift. He observed the adults around him, bent-backed workers carrying crates on the docks, factory employees coughing through lint-filled air, mothers counting every coin with trembling fingers. He saw the exhaustion in their eyes, the resignation that came from chasing opportunity only to find more hardship. And with that revelation came another. The path of honest labor was paved with endless struggle and meager reward. It was the criminal world, not the legitimate one, that offered escape from poverty. This realization was reinforced by the older boys he admired, gang members who strutted through the streets with confidence, wearing sharp clothes and carrying themselves with the kind of swagger that came only from having power. They were feared, respected, and free from the desperation that afflicted others in the slums. To a boy like Luciano, still impressionable and hungry for identity, these figures seemed larger than life. They represented an alternative future, one not shackled by the limitations of honest poverty. Luciano began his immersion into this world with small steps. He joined neighborhood gangs, initially as a runner and lookout. These early tasks were simple yet dangerous, delivering messages, guarding street corners, carrying packages whose contents he never questioned. Through these assignments he learned the first rules of the street: never hesitate, never trust too easily, and never show fear. Even at an early age, he possessed a calmness in risky situations that set him apart. While other boys trembled at the thought of violence, he studied it, watched the way threats were delivered, the way power shifted with a single gesture or word. His instincts drew attention. Older gang members noted his composure and his willingness to learn. He wasn't reckless, he was calculating. He didn't pick fights for pride but chose his battles with purpose. These qualities earned him entry into more serious operations: protection rackets, petty extortion, and the occasional street brawl that was as much a test of loyalty as of strength. Through these experiences, Luciano began to understand the deeper mechanics of criminal power. It wasn't brute force alone that ruled the streets. It was strategy, relationships, and the ability to project authority without necessarily having to wield it. One of the defining elements of his early life was the sheer diversity of the Lower East Side. Italians lived side by side with Jews, Irish, Poles, Russians, Chinese, and countless others. This mixing of cultures produced friction but also opportunity. Most young Italian boys kept to their own ethnic circles, bound by tradition and mistrust of outsiders. But Luciano didn't share these biases. He saw potential allies everywhere, people whose talents could complement his own ambitions. His friendships with Jewish boys, especially Meyer Lansky, would become legendary in later years, but even in his youth, these cross-ethnic alliances marked him as different. His bond with Lansky began not in an organized meeting but in a moment of confrontation. Luciano was still a teenager when he first stood off against a group of bigger boys who were harassing Lansky. Instead of escalating the fight, he diffused it with confidence and sharp words, earning the respect of both sides. Lansky saw in Luciano a rare combination of courage and practicality, while Luciano recognized Lansky's intelligence and ability to stay cool under pressure. Over time, their relationship grew into an unshakable partnership, one based not on heritage, but on shared ambition and an intuitive understanding that their futures were intertwined. But these were also years when Luciano learned that the path he had chosen came with consequences. Violence was an everyday reality. Street corners changed owners with bloody efficiency. Police officers patrolled the neighborhood not to protect its residents, but to collect bribes from the gangs that controlled it. Corruption seeped into every crack of the city's foundation. Luciano saw men arrested only to return to the streets the next day because they had paid the right person. He saw others dragged away and beaten for lacking the money or influence to avoid punishment. The message was clear. Power was not about legality, it was about leverage. His own encounters with violence deepened this understanding. He was beaten more than once, sometimes severely, and these experiences left a mark, not just on his body but on his psyche. One particular incident, when he was kidnapped and brutally assaulted by rival gang members, became a defining moment. He survived, barely, and rose from the experience with renewed resolve. The attack could have broken him, but instead, it solidified his belief that vulnerability was unacceptable. He vowed never to allow himself to be at someone else's mercy again. This event also earned him the nickname Lucky. Some attributed it to his survival against odds. Others said it came from his uncanny ability to evade long prison sentences despite constant brushes with the law. Whether the name was literal or symbolic, it stuck. But Luciano himself understood the truth. Luck alone didn't save him. It was instinct, preparation, and an ability to read danger before it struck. He cultivated these skills with increasing precision, turning them into tools that would later define his career. As Luciano moved deeper into the criminal hierarchy, he found himself drawn to figures who wielded real influence. Men who understood business as well as violence. He studied them closely, noting the flaws in their leadership. Many were rigid, trapped by old Sicilian codes that demanded loyalty to the past over adaptation to the present. They insisted on secrecy, hierarchy, and exclusion of anyone who wasn't one of them. This clinging to tradition frustrated Luciano. The world was changing rapidly, especially with the approach of prohibition. He sensed that whoever could harness these changes would dominate the future. Before the 1920s arrived, Luciano was already involved in illegal gambling operations, extortion schemes, and smuggling rings. These operations gave him a broader perspective on how interconnected the criminal world was becoming. He realized that the boundaries between ethnic groups were outdated. Jewish gangs were excellent financiers and strategists. Irish gangs controlled key political connections. Italian gangs had deep-rooted networks and a willingness to use violence. Separately, each group had strengths and weaknesses. Together, they could create an unstoppable alliance. This idea became one of Luciano's earliest strategic visions. But such ideas were dangerous. The old Italian bosses considered alliances with outsiders sacrilege. They valued purity of blood over profitability of partnership. They saw Luciano's friendships with Jewish and Irish boys as betrayal. Some warned him to distance himself, but he ignored them. He had already seen that loyalty based solely on heritage was fragile. Real loyalty, in his eyes, came from shared goals and mutual benefit. By the time Luciano reached his early 20s, he was no longer just another street kid. He was a man recognized for his sharp mind and strategic foresight. Older gang leaders began using him as a mediator between factions, trusting his ability to remain calm in negotiations and to see opportunities where others saw only threats. This growing reputation earned him money, respect, and influence, but also suspicion from those who feared his rise. Prohibition's arrival in 1920 transformed everything. The moment alcohol became illegal, a vast black market appeared overnight. Speakeasies sprouted like weeds, and bootlegging routes stretched from Canada to the Caribbean. Luciano understood instantly that this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The men who could organize production, transportation, and distribution would become kings. This was the moment he had been waiting for, a chance to build something far greater than a street gang. But even before he took control of bootlegging territories, the foundational elements of his ideology had already been forged. Years of poverty taught him the value of financial security. Years of street warfare taught him the necessity of alliances. Years of observing corrupt systems taught him that power came from influence, not brute force. And years of resisting the suffocating rules of the Old Mafia taught him that innovation was the key to survival. Luciano's personal evolution mirrored that of the city itself, moving from chaos toward an emerging, though still fragile, sense of structure. He learned the languages of the streets, the subtle cues of a potential betrayal, the unspoken agreements between rival factions, the delicate balance of trust and fear that held the underworld together. He refined the art of negotiation, recognizing that violence was sometimes necessary but often inefficient. He learned that the best leaders did not rule through intimidation alone. They ruled through control, perception, and strategic manipulation of resources. As he stepped further into adulthood, he carried with him the lessons of his childhood. The poverty that shaped his hunger, the friendships that broadened his vision, the violence that hardened his resolve, and the ambitions that defined his path. His early life was not a series of random events but a careful molding of a man who would eventually challenge centuries-old traditions and reshape the criminal underworld into something far more organized, profitable, and enduring than anything that had come before. The story of Luciano's rise is not one of luck but of preparation meeting opportunity. The streets taught him discipline. The gangs taught him politics. The betrayals taught him caution. And the diverse cultures of New York taught him that rigid boundaries were meant to be broken. These experiences converged into a worldview that set him apart from every other young gangster of his time. He was no longer simply Charles Luciano, the immigrant boy from Sicily. He was becoming Lucky Luciano, the strategist, the negotiator, the future architect of a criminal empire that would outlive its rivals and define an era. The world was changing. The underworld was changing. And Luciano was ready to shape it in his image. By the time Luciano entered his late teens, the streets of New York had already left their indelible mark on him. He had grown into a young man who carried the instincts of a survivor, the cunning of a strategist, and the quiet authority of someone who had learned the unspoken rules of power long before others could comprehend them. Every alleyway, tenement, and dock had served as a classroom. Every minor victory and every near-fatal encounter had been a lesson in patience, calculation, and understanding human nature. And it was in this crucible of hardship and opportunity that the street kid transformed into a rising figure whose ambition would soon challenge the very foundations of the underworld. Luciano's first taste of real authority came not from sheer force, but from his ability to command loyalty. In the chaotic ecosystem of the Lower East Side, gangs were the closest approximation to family that many young men knew. Leadership was earned through respect, intelligence, and, when necessary, ruthlessness. Luciano understood this deeply. He did not simply fight. He observed, calculated, and exploited the weaknesses and desires of others. He saw who sought power for its own sake, who could be manipulated through fear, and who could be persuaded with opportunity. By the time he was barely out of adolescence, he had a network of allies who followed him not merely because of threats, but because they recognized his vision and his capacity to make them richer, safer, and more influential. Prohibition had arrived like a tidal wave, transforming New York into a city awash with illicit opportunity. The criminal landscape was evolving faster than law enforcement could adapt. Speakeasies proliferated, bootlegging routes crisscrossed the eastern seaboard, and gangs that had once operated on a neighborhood scale suddenly controlled multi-million-dollar operations. Luciano understood immediately that traditional territorial thinking would no longer suffice. The future of crime lay not in small, isolated operations, but in networks that spanned neighborhoods, boroughs, and even states. The men who could see beyond immediate gains and create a system of organized cooperation would dominate. Luciano's mind worked like a strategist at a chessboard, seeing moves and countermoves before anyone else even recognized the pieces. His partnership with Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was central to this vision. These were men of intellect, ambition, and audacity, each complementing Luciano's own instincts. Lansky brought financial acumen and an understanding of risk management. Siegel brought charisma, resourcefulness, and the willingness to act decisively when opportunity demanded it. Together, they formed a triad of visionaries who understood that power was most potent when it was organized, diversified, and insulated from impulsive emotional decisions. The old mafia bosses, steeped in Sicilian tradition, could not foresee the scale of transformation that was coming. They valued loyalty and heritage above efficiency and innovation, and they underestimated the capacity of the younger generation to unify and professionalize the underworld. Luciano's early operations focused on smaller-scale enterprises, but his mind was already thinking far bigger. Gambling rings, extortion schemes, and labor rackets served as testing grounds for his strategies. Every transaction, alliance, and negotiation was both a source of income and a lesson in organizational management. He observed which individuals could be trusted with responsibilities, who could be leveraged for influence, and how to structure incentives so that cooperation became more profitable than defection. Violence was a tool, but one of many, and only effective when wielded strategically. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Luciano did not glorify brutality, he sought efficiency. A well-timed threat could achieve more than constant bloodshed. The young mobster recognized that fear without structure was fleeting, while a disciplined network could generate power and wealth indefinitely. The old mafia leaders began to notice him. Men who had ruled neighborhoods for decades sensed a threat, even if they did not yet understand it. Luciano's willingness to cross ethnic lines, to form alliances with Jewish and Irish gangsters, challenged the traditional notion that Sicilian bloodlines dictated loyalty. He ignored the warnings. To him, the rules of heritage were subordinate to the rules of business. Opportunity required pragmatism. In every negotiation, Luciano applied a mix of psychological insight, patience, and decisive action. He would sometimes wait months to implement a strategy, allowing rivals to reveal their weaknesses before striking. Other times he acted with brutal immediacy when advantage presented itself. Every move was calculated, every action deliberate. By the early 1920s, Luciano's operations had expanded beyond the Lower East Side. He controlled key gambling dens, coordinated bootlegging networks, and exerted influence over docks and unions that facilitated smuggling. But his ambitions were always larger than the immediate gains. He began envisioning a criminal ecosystem that resembled a corporation rather than a gang. Hierarchies, delegation, communication channels, and conflict resolution mechanisms became central to his thinking. While others fought petty turf wars, Luciano sought to consolidate, coordinate, and professionalize. He understood that efficiency would be the ultimate weapon in a world where violence alone was no longer sufficient to ensure dominance. This period was also a time of intense personal development. Luciano honed his ability to read people, understanding not just what they said, but what they feared, desired, and were willing to risk. He watched alliances form and dissolve, betrayals unfold, and loyalties tested. Each observation was a piece of data, feeding into a mental model of human behavior that would guide his leadership for decades. He learned that subtle gestures, a nod, a hesitation, a shift in tone, could reveal intentions as clearly as words. He became a master of perception management, using both action and inaction to manipulate outcomes in his favor. Luciano's methods were not purely theoretical. They were tested repeatedly in real-world scenarios. When rival gangs attempted to encroach on his operations, he did not react impulsively. He assessed the threat, identified leverage points, and then implemented measures to neutralize or absorb the opposition. Sometimes this meant alliances, sometimes strategic violence. He was careful to maintain the appearance of inevitability. Opponents who challenged him discovered quickly that the costs of confrontation far outweighed the benefits. By combining fear, respect, and opportunity, Luciano engineered compliance in ways that appeared seamless and almost natural. Those around him often underestimated the depth of his calculation until it was too late. At the same time, Luciano cultivated a public persona. He was approachable when it served his interests, charismatic when negotiation required persuasion, and ruthless when resistance demanded suppression. He understood that power depended on perception as much as reality. People needed to believe in his authority, sometimes more than they needed to fear it. By balancing charm and intimidation, Luciano ensured that allies were motivated by loyalty and ambition, while rivals hesitated to challenge him. This blend of psychological sophistication and operational savvy marked a departure from the older generation, whose leadership relied more on lineage, tradition, and displays of force. Prohibition-era New York was the perfect testing ground for these strategies. The illicit alcohol trade created immense wealth for those who could control it. Speakeasies and underground clubs flourished, requiring coordination between suppliers, distributors, and enforcers. Law enforcement was inconsistent and often corrupt, providing opportunities for manipulation and negotiation. Luciano thrived in this environment, using both legal loopholes and illegal influence to maximize profits while minimizing exposure. He treated crime as a system with inputs, outputs, and contingencies. This approach was revolutionary. It allowed him to scale operations and integrate diverse factions under a single vision. By his mid-20s, Luciano's reputation had solidified. He was no longer a street kid with potential. He was a figure of authority in the underworld, a man whose decisions could shape the trajectory of organized crime in New York. Allies trusted him, enemies feared him, and observers recognized the precision of his strategies. He had mastered the balance between aggression and patience, between perception and action, and between tradition and innovation. These qualities would allow him to challenge the old mafia bosses in ways no one could anticipate. But power is never absolute. As Luciano rose, the old guard resisted. Sicilian bosses clung to their traditions, seeing Luciano's methods as a threat to their authority and honor. Disputes simmered, and the city itself seemed poised for conflict. Luciano understood that the coming battles would not be won through brute force alone. They required coordination, foresight, and the ability to manipulate alliances. He began planning not just for survival but for transformation. He envisioned a reorganization of the mafia, one that would end internecine warfare, stabilize operations, and maximize profits. It was a vision that would ultimately define his career. Luciano's ascent during this period also illustrated his adaptability. He was not confined to the streets. He learned to navigate political and legal systems, leveraging influence to protect operations and expand opportunities. He recognized that power was multidimensional, encompassing economics, social networks, perception, and threat management. He combined all these elements with a meticulous attention to detail, ensuring that every action reinforced his strategic position. It was a synthesis of intelligence, psychology, and ambition that few contemporaries could match. The transformation from street kid to emerging kingpin was now complete. Luciano was no longer defined by circumstance, he was shaping it. He had learned every lesson the city could teach about power, loyalty, and risk. He had survived attacks, betrayed friends, and emerged stronger. He had built a network that spanned neighborhoods and ethnic lines. And he had envisioned a system of organized crime that could survive beyond any one individual. By the late 1920s, Charles Lucky Luciano had become more than a man. He was a force, a strategist, a rising architect of the modern underworld. The city, with all its chaos, corruption, and opportunity, had forged him into a figure who would not merely participate in the criminal world but dominate it. His vision, ambition, and intelligence were now inseparable from the very fabric of the city. Every speakeasy, dock, and gambling den he touched became a node in a growing empire. The Old Mafia, with its rigid codes and internecine violence, was ill-equipped to counter the kind of systemic, disciplined, and visionary approach Luciano was developing. He was no longer just reacting to the world around him, he was beginning to shape it. And so, in the streets of New York, a new chapter was beginning. The chaos of the old order would soon collide with the calculated ambition of a young man who had learned every lesson the city could teach, who had survived every test, and who was ready to challenge the old hierarchy. The rise of Luciano was no accident. It was the product of instinct, intelligence, opportunity, and an unshakable vision for a future he intended to control. From the narrow tenements and shadowed alleys, the boy who had once run messages for local gangs was emerging as the architect of a criminal empire that would redefine organized crime forever. As Luciano moved from adolescence into young adulthood, his streetwise instincts and ambition naturally drew him deeper into the underworld. What began as small-time schemes, running errands for local shopkeepers, collecting debts, and petty theft, gradually escalated into more organized criminal activity. The streets of Manhattan were his classroom, and the city's bustling underworld his teacher. It was here that Luciano learned the subtleties of negotiation, the delicate balance between intimidation and persuasion, and the importance of alliances. He quickly realized that survival and success required more than brute strength. They demanded psychological insight, timing, and the ability to read people with near-perfect accuracy. Luciano's first steps into serious crime were pragmatic and opportunistic. He began working with small-time gangsters, taking on jobs that involved theft, extortion, and street-level protection. Each task was a lesson in power dynamics: who could be trusted, who was a threat, and how to manipulate situations to his advantage. While others relied solely on violence to assert authority, Luciano combined charm, strategy, and ruthlessness, earning a reputation as both reliable and dangerous. Even minor victories enhanced his standing in the local network of criminals, slowly establishing him as someone who could be counted on and feared. The city itself provided fertile ground for such an ascent. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, had created a new and unprecedented opportunity for organized crime, turning what had once been small-scale, localized operations into highly lucrative enterprises. Bootlegging, speakeasies, and illegal gambling offered not only wealth but influence, and Luciano recognized that he could rise faster by aligning himself with the right people. He began to forge relationships with key players in the underworld, understanding that alliances, carefully chosen, were more valuable than isolated acts of violence. These early partnerships laid the groundwork for the broader networks he would eventually control, allowing him to learn the art of leadership and the subtleties of power before he commanded a larger organization. At the same time, Luciano's engagement in crime was not reckless. He exhibited a remarkable sense of timing and discretion. Unlike other young gang members who sought instant recognition through flashy displays of violence, Luciano understood the value of patience and careful observation. He watched the patterns of law enforcement, the movements of rival gangs, and the weaknesses of older mafia bosses. Each encounter, each small act of extortion or theft, was calculated to increase his knowledge, expand his influence, and minimize unnecessary risk. It was a measured approach that would later allow him to consolidate power in a world where impulsiveness often led to death. These formative criminal years also revealed Luciano's ability to navigate the complex moral terrain of the streets. He learned which battles were worth fighting, which rivals could be turned into allies, and which situations required tactical retreat. His early interactions with law enforcement, fellow gang members, and local business owners taught him that loyalty was transactional, respect could be earned through strategy as much as fear, and reputation was as critical as actual strength. By mastering these lessons, Luciano distinguished himself from contemporaries who relied purely on intimidation or inherited authority. Importantly, Luciano's first steps into crime showcased his ability to innovate within a rigid system. While older mafia figures clung to tradition, he experimented with new methods of organization and revenue generation. He observed how rival groups operated, identifying inefficiencies, conflicts, and opportunities for consolidation. Even at this early stage, Luciano's mind was focused on not just surviving, but on creating a framework for power that could outlast the volatile dynamics of street-level crime. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, opportunities where others saw threat, and potential alliances where others saw enemies. By the time Luciano was fully embedded in organized criminal activity, he had developed both a practical skill set and a psychological toolkit that set him apart. He could manipulate situations, assess risk with uncanny precision, and inspire both loyalty and fear. These early experiences were the crucible in which his ambition, strategy, and ruthlessness were forged. They prepared him for the next stage, rising through the ranks of the mafia, where the stakes were higher, the power greater, and the dangers far more deadly. The foundation of his future empire had been laid, built not through sudden leaps but through careful, deliberate steps into the shadowy world of crime. As Luciano transitioned from a street-level operator to a serious player in the criminal underworld, he began navigating the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and hierarchies that defined organized crime in New York. Rising through the ranks was not a matter of brute strength alone. It required strategy, charisma, and an intuitive understanding of human behavior. Luciano's keen observational skills allowed him to identify patterns in how older mafia figures conducted business, who wielded influence, who could be manipulated, and who posed a threat. He was deliberate in choosing his mentors and allies, carefully aligning himself with those whose protection and knowledge could accelerate his ascent, while simultaneously keeping potential rivals in check. Luciano's early association with established Sicilian mafia figures was crucial. He learned from seasoned operators the delicate balance of respect, fear, and loyalty, as well as the importance of adhering to, or selectively bending, the traditional codes that govern mafia conduct. Yet even as he absorbed these lessons, Luciano was quietly reshaping his own vision of power. Unlike the older bosses, he understood that rigid adherence to tradition could be a limitation. Where others saw loyalty as an absolute, Luciano saw it as a tool, something to be negotiated, leveraged, and occasionally sacrificed for strategic advantage. This dual approach of respecting the old ways while innovating new methods became a hallmark of his rise. Key alliances proved essential to his ascent. Luciano recognized that consolidation of influence required more than personal ambition. It required strategic partnerships. He cultivated relationships with both Sicilian and non-Sicilian gangsters, bridging ethnic divides to create mutually beneficial arrangements. These alliances were not just about pooling resources, they were psychological plays designed to project strength, foster trust, and create dependency. By positioning himself as both a mediator and a reliable partner, Luciano was able to neutralize potential threats before they fully materialized, turning rivals into collaborators and isolated power into coordinated networks. Simultaneously, Luciano's reputation for calculated ruthlessness spread. Unlike impulsive gang members who resorted to violence at the first sign of opposition, Luciano was selective, precise, and strategic in his use of force. A well-timed act of intimidation could accomplish far more than reckless aggression, earning him respect without unnecessary exposure. His capacity to combine diplomacy with decisive action made him increasingly indispensable within the network, and he soon became recognized not merely as a capable soldier, but as a rising architect of influence. Mentorship played a subtle yet critical role in Luciano's progression. Older mafia figures, initially viewing him as an ambitious upstart, began to see in him a blend of intelligence and pragmatism that surpassed many of their contemporaries. Through these relationships, Luciano gained access to insider knowledge about operations, financial structures, and the delicate politics of the criminal world. He learned how to broker deals between rival factions, how to interpret the nuances of loyalty, and how to exploit weaknesses in others while maintaining a veneer of cooperation. These lessons were instrumental in transforming his street-level cunning into strategic leadership. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had not only secured a place within the mafia hierarchy but had begun to reshape it subtly in his image. He observed the inefficiencies, rivalries, and outdated methods that hampered the older generation and imagined a more streamlined, business-oriented model. His ambitions were no longer limited to personal survival or incremental gains. He was thinking about structure, control, and the creation of a system that could generate wealth, influence, and stability. The seeds of the commission, the governing body he would later establish, were already taking root in his strategic mind, informed by years of careful observation, negotiation, and tactical maneuvering. Psychologically, Luciano's rise was as much about perception as it was about action. He understood that power in the mafia was a narrative, constructed through reputation, demonstrated ability, and the careful manipulation of others' expectations. By cultivating an image of intelligence, decisiveness, and controlled ruthlessness, Luciano commanded respect from allies and fear from rivals. This duality allowed him to operate in spaces that others could not, negotiating deals, orchestrating alliances, and consolidating power while remaining one step ahead of potential threats. By the end of this period, Luciano had transformed from a promising street-level operator into a major force within the mafia, poised to challenge tradition, broker unprecedented alliances, and ultimately reshape organized crime in America. His ascent was not just a story of ambition, it was a study in strategic thinking, psychological mastery, and the art of navigating complex human networks. The foundation was set for the revolutionary changes he would impose on the underworld, a transformation that would elevate him from one of many ambitious criminals to the undisputed architect of modern organized crime. Luciano's rise within the mafia was not merely about personal power, it was a revolution in the very structure of organized crime. By the late 1920s, he had recognized that the traditional, feud-driven and fragmented approach of the old mafia was a liability, both financially and strategically. The city's criminal landscape was rife with violence, inefficiency, and missed opportunities, and the rigid adherence to outdated Sicilian codes left the organization vulnerable to law enforcement and rival gangs. Luciano envisioned a new model, one in which organized crime operated with the precision and efficiency of a legitimate corporation, where violence was calculated rather than impulsive, and profit was prioritized over pride. This vision would ultimately redefine the American underworld and cement his legacy as the father of modern organized crime. At the heart of Luciano's reorganization was the principle of structure over chaos. He sought to create a system where each family or faction operated with a clear hierarchy, responsibilities were defined, and disputes could be resolved through negotiation rather than bloodshed. The goal was stability, both internally and externally, which would allow for expansion, collaboration, and more lucrative ventures. To achieve this, Luciano emphasized merit and competence over birthright or tradition, promoting individuals who demonstrated intelligence, loyalty, and strategic skill, rather than simply those who inherited a position or wielded brute strength. This approach not only enhanced operational efficiency but also increased loyalty, as men understood that their rise within the organization was contingent upon performance, discretion, and allegiance. One of Luciano's most groundbreaking innovations was the creation of a governing council, later known as the Commission. This body served as a central authority to arbitrate disputes, allocate territories, and coordinate activities among competing families. By providing a formal mechanism for mediation, Luciano reduced the frequency of violent conflicts that had previously weakened the mafia and threatened profitability. The Commission also enabled collaborative ventures such as large-scale bootlegging, gambling operations, and labor rackets, by allowing different factions to pool resources and share profits while maintaining autonomy. This balance of independence and centralized control represented a seismic shift in criminal organization, transforming what had been a patchwork of feuding gangs into a coordinated and formidable enterprise. Luciano also understood the importance of diversification in criminal enterprise. While traditional mafia operations focused primarily on extortion, gambling, and local influence, Luciano sought to expand into multiple streams of revenue, integrating activities such as narcotics trafficking, labor racketeering, and real estate manipulation. Each operation was treated with a business-like rigor. Risk assessments, careful planning, and strategic partnerships were emphasized over impulsive decisions. By professionalizing the operations, Luciano increased both profitability and sustainability, ensuring that the organization could withstand law enforcement pressure, internal disputes, and market fluctuations. Violence, a staple of the old mafia, was recalibrated under Luciano's leadership. He did not abolish it, rather he applied it selectively as a tool of strategy and control. Assassinations and intimidation were employed not as expressions of personal vendetta but as calculated measures to enforce authority, protect investments, or eliminate genuine threats. This approach minimized unnecessary attention from the authorities while maximizing psychological impact on rivals and potential challengers. Luciano's ability to balance aggression with diplomacy was a key factor in consolidating his power, demonstrating that true control required intelligence and foresight, not mere brutality. The psychological and social dimensions of Luciano's reforms were equally significant. He cultivated an environment where loyalty was rewarded, ambition could flourish, and calculated risk was respected. At the same time, he fostered fear and respect by demonstrating that betrayal or incompetence would not be tolerated. This combination of incentives and deterrence created a disciplined organization, capable of executing complex operations across multiple territories while maintaining internal cohesion. Luciano's vision extended beyond immediate gains. He sought to create a sustainable system that could endure beyond any single leader, a model of organized crime that was adaptable, profitable, and resilient. Luciano's reforms also involved the careful integration of non-Italian criminals into the network, breaking down some of the ethnic barriers that had previously limited cooperation. He understood that alliances with Jewish, Irish, and other ethnic gangs could expand influence, access new markets, and reduce conflict. By negotiating partnerships and enforcing agreements through both diplomacy and strategic displays of power, Luciano created a network that was broader, more cohesive, and more profitable than anything the Old Mafia had achieved. These relationships, managed with meticulous attention to hierarchy and loyalty, exemplified his talent for psychological manipulation and strategic foresight. By the end of this transformative period, Luciano had not only solidified his personal power but also redefined the very nature of organized crime in America. The Mafia was no longer a collection of violent, squabbling families. It had become a sophisticated, hierarchical, and highly profitable enterprise capable of strategic expansion and coordinated action. Luciano's combination of business acumen, psychological insight, and controlled ruthlessness allowed him to impose order on chaos, turning an inefficient and volatile underworld into a disciplined, profitable, and enduring criminal empire. It was a revolution not just in wealth and influence, but in the philosophy of crime itself, a blueprint that would shape the structure and operations of organized crime for decades to come. Luciano's rise to power was as much a triumph of intellect and psychological mastery as it was of ambition and strategy. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied solely on brute force or inherited influence, Luciano possessed an acute understanding of human behavior, social dynamics, and the interplay of fear and loyalty. He recognized that true power was not simply taking what one wanted, but controlling perception, shaping narratives, and managing the ambitions and insecurities of others. Every interaction, whether with allies, rivals, or law enforcement, was calculated to reinforce his authority, expand his influence, and minimize unnecessary risk. Central to Luciano's psychology of power was his ability to blend charm with ruthlessness. He could be affable, persuasive, and disarmingly personable when needed, earning the trust of allies and making potential rivals underestimate him. Yet behind this charisma lay a calculating mind, capable of anticipating reactions, identifying weaknesses, and exploiting them with precision. This duality made him both approachable and intimidating, a combination that allowed him to navigate complex alliances and negotiate delicate agreements while ensuring that loyalty was maintained and defiance discouraged. Those who misjudged him often found themselves outmaneuvered or eliminated, while those who aligned with him prospered under his guidance. Luciano's strategic thinking extended to the management of risk. He understood that overextension, impulsivity, or unnecessary displays of violence could destabilize both his position and the broader organization. Every decision, whether a territorial negotiation, a business expansion, or an act of intimidation, was weighed carefully against potential consequences. This meticulous approach allowed him to maintain control in an environment defined by unpredictability and violence. By projecting confidence, foresight, and decisiveness, he created the perception of invincibility, which further consolidated his authority and discouraged challenges from rivals. A crucial element of his psychological strategy was the manipulation of loyalty. Luciano realized that allegiance could be shaped and directed, rather than demanded blindly. He rewarded competence and reliability, offering protection, opportunity, and advancement to those who proved useful. Conversely, betrayal or incompetence was met with swift, unmistakable consequences. This balance of incentive and deterrence fostered a disciplined and motivated network, where members were driven by both ambition and fear. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to maintain this equilibrium, ensuring that the organization operated smoothly while reinforcing his personal dominance. Luciano also understood the power of perception on a broader scale. In the public eye, he projected a controlled, calculated figure, neither overly flamboyant nor openly violent, allowing him to avoid the spotlight that could attract law enforcement scrutiny. He managed his image carefully, cultivating an aura of professionalism and intelligence that contrasted with the chaotic, impulsive behavior of many of his rivals. This perception of order and capability extended to his criminal operations, presenting an image of a mafia that was disciplined, strategic, and above all, effective. By controlling how he was seen, Luciano could manipulate outcomes without direct confrontation, relying on influence as much as force. The psychological complexity of Luciano's power extended to his treatment of rivals and potential threats. He was patient, often waiting for the right moment to strike, allowing adversaries to reveal their weaknesses or make missteps. He employed both diplomacy and intimidation, calibrating his approach to the specific individual or situation. This flexibility in strategy made him unpredictable and difficult to counter, reinforcing his reputation as a mastermind capable of orchestrating the underworld with unparalleled skill. At the core of Luciano's psychological approach was an understanding of human ambition and desire. He recognized that people were motivated by opportunity, fear, respect, and greed, and he tailored his interactions accordingly. Allies were incentivized to act in ways that reinforced his position, while rivals were manipulated into overreaching or submitting. His ability to read people, anticipate actions, and shape outcomes through subtle influence rather than overt coercion allowed him to maintain a level of control far beyond what brute force alone could achieve. By mastering these psychological dynamics, Luciano was able to transform the mafia from a fragmented, violent network into a disciplined and strategic organization. His influence was not merely enforced through violence, it was embedded in the very way the organization thought, operated, and responded to challenges. This mastery of perception, loyalty, and human behavior became the cornerstone of his authority, setting the stage for his consolidation of power, the restructuring of the mafia, and his eventual dominance over the criminal underworld. In essence, Luciano's genius lay not just in what he controlled, but in how he shaped the minds, motivations, and actions of everyone around him, creating an empire that functioned with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine while maintaining the psychological grip necessary to command respect and fear. The rise of Lucky Luciano was inseparable from the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and family ties that defined the Mafia of New York. In the 1920s and 1930s, the city's underworld was a constantly shifting landscape of loyalties and betrayals, where yesterday's friend could become today's mortal enemy. For Luciano, navigating this world required both acute strategic thinking and a deep understanding of human nature. He knew that power was rarely absolute. It was relational, dependent on who you aligned with, who feared you, and who believed that their best chance for survival and prosperity lay in your favor. Each alliance was carefully cultivated, each betrayal calculated, and each relationship measured against the long-term expansion of influence. Luciano's network of allies was diverse and strategically chosen. Within the Italian-American Mafia, he fostered close ties with emerging leaders who shared his vision of a more organized, business-like criminal enterprise. These relationships were often cemented through both formal agreements and personal trust, strengthened by shared ambition and mutual respect for capability. Yet Luciano's alliances were never purely personal. They were transactional, each side gaining tangible benefits while contributing to a larger, coordinated strategy. By creating these networks, Luciano was able to consolidate power more efficiently than his rivals, who often relied on loyalty dictated by tradition rather than competence. Rivalries, however, were inevitable. The Old Mafia's older guard viewed Luciano's methods and rapid rise with suspicion, resentment, and outright hostility. They were entrenched in the Sicilian codes of honor and tradition, and Luciano's pragmatic, innovative approach threatened not only their authority but their way of life. Navigating these rivalries required both tact and ruthlessness. Luciano was adept at gauging when to negotiate, when to intimidate, and when to strike decisively. He could exploit rivalries, turning opponents against one another, and thereby reducing threats without engaging in direct conflict. This psychological maneuvering was a hallmark of his rise, controlling the battlefield not merely through force, but through manipulation, perception, and strategic foresight. Betrayal was a constant danger, and Luciano understood that trust had to be earned and continuously tested. He maintained a network of informants, advisors, and intermediaries who provided him with intelligence about potential threats or disloyalty. When betrayals occurred, he responded with precision, ensuring that consequences were severe enough to deter others while avoiding actions that might destabilize his broader network. This balance of reward and punishment fostered loyalty while maintaining an atmosphere of calculated fear, a duality that kept allies aligned and rivals cautious. Bloodlines and family connections also played a critical role in Luciano's alliances and power dynamics. Many of the older mafia figures relied on hereditary status, promoting kin over merit. Luciano, while respecting these bonds enough to navigate the politics of the organization, increasingly prioritized skill, reliability, and strategic value over lineage. This meritocratic approach allowed him to recruit talented individuals who might have been overlooked by traditionalists, strengthening his faction and gradually shifting the culture of the mafia toward efficiency, loyalty, and pragmatism rather than pure heritage. Beyond the Italian mafia, Luciano also cultivated strategic partnerships with non-Italian gangs, recognizing that cooperation could yield tremendous opportunities. Jewish, Irish, and other ethnic crime groups controlled critical operations in bootlegging, gambling, and labor rackets. By negotiating mutually beneficial arrangements, Luciano expanded his influence and revenue streams while simultaneously reducing the risk of violent conflict with these groups. These alliances were carefully managed, often requiring personal diplomacy, financial incentive, and subtle displays of power to ensure cooperation. In this way, Luciano extended his reach beyond the traditional ethnic boundaries of organized crime, laying the groundwork for the more inclusive and corporate-like structure he would later formalize through the Commission. The dynamics of allies, betrayals, and bloodlines were not merely operational, they were deeply psychological. Luciano understood that perception was as powerful as reality. By maintaining an image of calculated authority, he ensured that both allies and enemies perceived him as a force to be respected, feared, and ultimately followed. His ability to inspire loyalty while deterring rebellion relied on a careful combination of rewards, threats, and strategic visibility. Every meeting, negotiation, and public action was designed to reinforce his standing within the underworld, consolidating power not just through deeds but through the subtle manipulation of perception. By skillfully balancing alliances, managing betrayals, and navigating family and ethnic dynamics, Luciano created a foundation of influence that allowed him to operate with unprecedented authority. His ability to integrate diverse factions, mediate disputes, and anticipate treachery distinguished him from his peers and positioned him as the central figure in a transforming underworld. This intricate web of relationships was both his shield and his sword, enabling him to consolidate power while minimizing direct conflict and establishing the strategic framework for the revolutionary organization he would ultimately lead. Through this complex interplay of loyalty and treachery, ambition and pragmatism, Luciano not only survived the perilous politics of the New York Mafia but thrived, building a network that was resilient, adaptable, and ready to support the larger transformation of organized crime that would define his legacy. Beneath the surface of New York's bustling streets and glitzy speakeasies, a hidden war was raging, one that few outside the underworld fully understood. While the public saw bootlegging, gambling, and prohibition-era nightlife as mere vice, Luciano and his contemporaries were engaged in a complex struggle for control, influence, and survival. This shadow war involved constant maneuvering, rival factions jockeyed for territory, alliances shifted overnight, and every action had to be calculated against the potential for betrayal or violent retaliation. For Luciano, navigating this hidden war required not only strategic insight but also a mastery of timing, psychology, and foresight. The internal conflicts of the mafia were relentless. Traditional Sicilian families, threatened by Luciano's innovation and rising influence, continued to operate under old codes that prioritized honor and vendetta over profit and efficiency. Feuds erupted over territory, control of illegal markets, and personal slights, often escalating into violent confrontations that drew the attention of law enforcement and destabilized local networks. Yet Luciano approached these conflicts differently than his predecessors. He sought to neutralize threats through diplomacy when possible, strike decisively when necessary, and manipulate outcomes in a way that maximized his advantage while minimizing unnecessary bloodshed. This balance of strategy and force became a defining characteristic of his leadership. Government pressure added another layer of complexity to this clandestine conflict. Law enforcement agencies were increasingly focused on organized crime, fueled by public outcry over the rise of bootlegging, violence, and corruption. Police raids, federal investigations, and judicial scrutiny forced Luciano and his allies to operate with discretion and caution. Unlike earlier criminals who relied solely on intimidation or bribery, Luciano understood the importance of managing exposure. He developed methods to insulate his operations, delegate risky activities to trusted associates, and maintain plausible deniability for himself. This strategic foresight allowed him to expand his empire while avoiding the pitfalls that had ensnared many of his predecessors. Covert maneuvers were central to Luciano's approach in this hidden war. Intelligence gathering became a vital tool. Informants, corrupt officials, and sympathetic intermediaries provided insights into rival activities, law enforcement priorities, and potential vulnerabilities. Luciano leveraged this information to anticipate moves by competitors, orchestrate alliances, and execute calculated strikes that would shift the balance of power. Violence, when employed, was surgical and purposeful, designed to achieve strategic objectives rather than satisfy personal vendettas. This measured approach allowed Luciano to consolidate power more effectively than rivals who relied on reactionary aggression, giving him a decisive edge in the chaotic landscape of organized crime. The bootlegging era itself intensified the stakes of this covert war. Prohibition created immense wealth but also fierce competition, as gangs vied for control of lucrative liquor markets. Luciano recognized that domination required both cooperation and suppression. Rival gangs could be valuable partners if aligned with strategy, but threats had to be neutralized swiftly and decisively. His ability to negotiate alliances across ethnic and territorial lines, while simultaneously eliminating or sidelining dangerous competitors, exemplified his tactical genius. By controlling the flow of information, resources, and influence, Luciano ensured that he remained several steps ahead of both rivals and authorities. Psychologically, this hidden war demanded constant vigilance. Luciano had to assess not only the capabilities and intentions of his enemies but also the loyalty, ambition, and reliability of his own associates. Any miscalculation could lead to catastrophic consequences, whether a violent uprising, betrayal, or government crackdown. His success in this environment stemmed from his ability to integrate observation, intuition, and calculated action, creating a network that was disciplined, responsive, and strategically aligned. Allies were motivated to act in ways that reinforced his position, while rivals were often manipulated into mistakes that weakened their influence and reinforced his dominance. The war also highlighted the tension between tradition and innovation. Older mobsters often reacted to challenges emotionally, guided by long-standing codes of honor, while Luciano approached the same situations analytically, prioritizing outcomes over sentiment. He was able to exploit the rigidity and predictability of traditionalists, using their adherence to protocol against them. This intellectual advantage allowed him to orchestrate complex maneuvers, alliances, assassinations, territorial negotiations, that would have been unimaginable to those trapped in the old ways. In doing so, Luciano not only survived the hidden war but used it as a stepping stone to greater power, turning chaos into opportunity. By the time Luciano had solidified his position, the hidden war had tested every facet of his skill: strategic thinking, psychological insight, operational planning, and leadership under pressure. It was a proving ground that separated him from ordinary criminals, transforming him into a master of both overt and covert operations. Every alliance, every betrayal, every calculated act of violence had reinforced his authority, expanded his influence, and demonstrated that control in the shadows required far more than fear. It demanded intelligence, foresight, and an unerring understanding of human behavior. The hidden war of New York's underworld was the crucible in which Luciano's empire was forged, preparing him for the legal and personal challenges that would soon threaten to unravel his carefully constructed world. The rise of Lucky Luciano, however, was not without peril. By the early 1930s, the empire he had painstakingly built was beginning to attract the scrutiny of law enforcement, politicians, and even rival criminals whose patience with his consolidation of power had run thin. Despite his careful management of perception, alliances, and operations, Luciano's growing prominence made him a target. His innovative methods, while highly effective, disrupted the status quo, creating enemies both within the Italian-American mafia and beyond. In this precarious environment, the first cracks in his seemingly invincible facade began to appear, marking the start of a period that would test his resilience, ingenuity, and psychological acuity. The catalyst for Luciano's downfall was multifaceted. Law enforcement agencies were increasingly emboldened by public outrage over organized crime and the violent consequences of prohibition. High-profile murders, gangland wars, and corruption scandals made the headlines, putting pressure on prosecutors and the police to act decisively. Luciano's operations, extensive and highly visible in their reach, were difficult to conceal completely. Despite employing layers of intermediaries and careful operational planning, traces of his involvement began to surface, attracting attention that could no longer be ignored. Internal betrayal compounded these external pressures. Some of Luciano's former allies, motivated by ambition, resentment, or fear, began to distance themselves or cooperate with law enforcement to protect their own interests. In the intricate web of mafia relationships, loyalty was fragile, and even the most disciplined networks could be undermined by opportunists. Luciano's reputation for ruthlessness, while deterring some betrayals, also created envy and fear that motivated others to preemptively strike, either through defection or legal means. Each betrayal chipped away at the security of his empire, forcing him to navigate a growing web of threats on multiple fronts. The arrest that marked the beginning of Luciano's fall was a dramatic culmination of these pressures. He was implicated in a series of criminal activities, from gambling operations to more serious charges, and the legal machinery moved against him with increasing determination. Despite his careful planning and legal maneuvering, the combined weight of witness testimonies, informants, and investigative diligence left him vulnerable. The arrest was not only a personal setback but also a symbolic moment that signaled the vulnerability of even the most cunning and powerful figures in the underworld. Psychologically, the experience of arrest and impending trial forced Luciano to confront the limits of control. The streets of New York, which had once been his domain, now felt distant and dangerous. The alliances he had forged were tested under pressure, and the loyalty of associates was strained by fear of law enforcement retaliation. For the first time, Luciano was forced to operate in an environment where careful planning, influence, and intimidation were not always sufficient to guarantee survival. It was a humbling and dangerous period, one that would redefine the contours of his empire and force him to rely on both legal strategy and covert maneuvering to retain influence. During this period, Luciano also faced intense media scrutiny. Newspapers sensationalized his life, depicting him as both a master criminal and a symbol of the societal chaos wrought by organized crime. Public perception added an additional layer of pressure, influencing the political and judicial response to his activities. Luciano's carefully constructed image of controlled, calculated authority was challenged by sensationalized narratives that painted him as an uncontrollable threat, increasing both public outrage and official determination to see him prosecuted. Yet even in the midst of this fall, Luciano's strategic mind remained active. He continued to coordinate aspects of his operations through intermediaries, leveraging loyalty and fear to maintain control over critical components of his empire. He anticipated the moves of prosecutors, rivals, and potential defectors, using a combination of legal defense, negotiation, and subtle manipulation to protect his interests. The fall was not a sudden collapse but a complex interplay of pressure, betrayal, and calculated responses, each decision revealing both his vulnerability and his enduring capacity for strategy under duress. This period also highlighted the precarious balance between power and exposure. Luciano's fall began with the realization that no amount of innovation, alliances, or intimidation could fully insulate him from legal and political realities. The structures he had built could be disrupted not only by rivals and betrayal but by systemic forces beyond his direct control. Yet, the very strategies that had enabled his rise, meticulous planning, psychological insight, and manipulation of perception, also provided the tools to navigate his partial downfall. Even as his personal freedom was threatened, Luciano's influence remained, a testament to the resilience of the systems he had constructed and the enduring efficacy of his strategic mind. The fall of Luciano was therefore not a simple narrative of defeat. It was a complex, tension-filled chapter in the life of a man whose genius lay in both adaptation and foresight. Arrest and betrayal forced him to confront the vulnerabilities of power, the fragility of loyalty, and the inevitability of external pressures. Yet even in this moment of crisis, he demonstrated the same combination of psychological acuity, strategic calculation, and controlled ruthlessness that had defined his rise. The events of this period set the stage for the dramatic courtroom confrontations, legal battles, and eventual transformations that would shape the later chapters of his life, underscoring the dualities of ambition, control, and vulnerability that defined the legend of Lucky Luciano. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a courtroom drama. It was a high-stakes battle for reputation, influence, and survival that captivated the city and symbolized the clash between old-world criminal traditions and modern law enforcement. By the time the proceedings began, Luciano had already become a household name, his reputation for cunning, ruthlessness, and innovation preceding him. Newspapers sensationalized every development, portraying him as both a master manipulator and a dangerous emblem of organized crime. The city watched as the legal system sought to assert authority over a man who had, for years, operated with near immunity, controlling vast criminal networks and eluding capture through careful planning, strategic alliances and psychological insight. The charges against Luciano were serious, ranging from gambling operations to prostitution rackets and indirect involvement in violent crimes. Prosecutors painted a picture of a man who had not only orchestrated a sprawling criminal enterprise but had done so with remarkable intelligence and strategic foresight. Witnesses were called, many of them former associates or coerced informants, to testify against him, recounting operations, meetings, and the inner workings of his organization. The courtroom became a stage on which Luciano's entire life and career were dissected, analyzed, and debated, forcing him to confront both the tangible evidence of his actions and the constructed narratives surrounding his persona. Luciano's defense, however, was a study in calculated poise. He understood that in addition to the legal arguments, perception was a crucial battleground. His legal team worked meticulously to challenge evidence, discredit witnesses, and exploit procedural weaknesses, all while maintaining an image of calm, rational authority that contrasted sharply with the sensationalized portrayal of him as a violent mastermind. Luciano's own demeanor during the trial, controlled, articulate, and seemingly unfazed, reinforced his reputation for strategic thinking and psychological mastery. Every gesture, every statement, was part of a larger performance designed to influence both the jury and the public, highlighting his ability to manipulate perception even under extreme pressure. The courtroom drama was further intensified by the interplay of politics, public opinion, and law enforcement ambition. Prosecutors were under immense pressure to secure a conviction, not only to uphold the law but to demonstrate the capacity of the state to contain organized crime. Media coverage amplified this pressure, presenting the trial as a moral and societal battleground. For Luciano, this meant that victory or defeat in court was not just about personal liberty, it was about the continued stability of his empire, the loyalty of his associates, and the broader perception of his invincibility within the criminal world. Each day of testimony, cross-examination, and legal maneuvering carried enormous stakes, both practical and symbolic. One of the most significant aspects of the trial was how it exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in even the most meticulously constructed criminal enterprise. Luciano's extensive network, while disciplined and strategically managed, relied on intermediaries and compartmentalization to operate effectively. However, the pressure of law enforcement scrutiny and the willingness of some associates to cooperate as witnesses revealed that even a master strategist could be vulnerable to betrayal and exposure. The trial highlighted the delicate balance between loyalty, fear, and self-interest within the underworld, underscoring the human elements that could undermine even the most sophisticated systems of control. Despite the mounting evidence and the intensity of the legal assault, Luciano's response was emblematic of his lifelong approach to power. Calculated, adaptive, and psychologically astute. He leveraged legal technicalities, negotiated behind the scenes, and maintained a controlled presence that reinforced his authority even in apparent defeat. His ability to anticipate the moves of prosecutors and witnesses, combined with his skill in manipulating perception, allowed him to mitigate some of the immediate damage, though the eventual conviction was a setback that no amount of strategy could entirely prevent. The sentencing marked a turning point not only in Luciano's personal life but also in the evolution of the mafia he had reshaped. While he faced years of imprisonment, his influence did not vanish. His organization had been structured to endure beyond his immediate presence, a testament to the foresight and innovation that had defined his rise. From prison, Luciano continued to exert control over his network through loyal intermediaries, demonstrating that authority was not confined to physical freedom but could be maintained through disciplined hierarchy, psychological influence, and strategic planning. The trial and sentencing also underscored the dualities that defined Luciano's life: power and vulnerability, loyalty and betrayal, visibility and control. In the public eye, he had become a cautionary tale of criminal audacity. Within the underworld, he remained a central figure whose systems and strategies continued to influence operations. This period illustrated that mastery of organized crime required more than ambition or violence. It demanded foresight, psychological acuity, and the ability to navigate both legal and human complexities simultaneously. Ultimately, Luciano's trial was both a culmination and a test. It was the public reckoning for a man who had reshaped the mafia, a high-stakes confrontation that threatened to unravel the empire he had built, and a dramatic display of the tension between old-world criminal traditions and modern law enforcement. Yet, even in the face of conviction, Luciano's strategic genius, psychological insight, and capacity for controlled influence ensured that his authority endured. The courtroom may have imposed legal consequences, but it could not erase the structures, relationships, and perception of power that Luciano had meticulously cultivated over decades. Even behind the walls of prison, Lucky Luciano's influence remained formidable, a testament to the meticulous systems and psychological mastery he had cultivated over decades. Unlike many criminals whose power diminishes once removed from the streets, Luciano understood that true authority was not dependent solely on physical presence but on the networks, perception, and loyalty he had meticulously constructed. From the moment of his incarceration, he began orchestrating operations, issuing directives, and maintaining control over his empire through intermediaries who were both trusted and carefully vetted. Prison, rather than being a limit, became a different kind of stage for his strategic genius, where influence was exercised with patience, subtlety, and precision. Luciano's ability to govern from prison relied heavily on the hierarchy and delegation he had established during his rise. By empowering key lieutenants and family heads, he ensured that operational control remained in the hands of loyal associates who understood his methods, objectives, and expectations. Communication was carefully managed, with coded messages, trusted emissaries, and clandestine meetings facilitating directives without exposing him to unnecessary risk. This structure mirrored a corporate model, with Luciano as the CEO. Strategic decisions flowed from the top, while day-to-day operations were managed by trusted deputies, allowing the organization to function efficiently despite his physical absence. The psychological dimension of Luciano's control was equally important. His reputation for intelligence, decisiveness, and calculated ruthlessness preceded him into the prison environment. Associates and rivals alike recognized that his capacity for influence extended beyond immediate presence, reinforcing loyalty and discouraging defection. Even subtle communications or symbolic gestures were imbued with authority, reminding members of the organization that Luciano's oversight was constant. This perception of enduring control was as powerful as any direct action, ensuring compliance and shaping behavior across his network. From within prison, Luciano also navigated the delicate balance of risk and opportunity. He remained acutely aware that intermediaries could betray him or be compromised by law enforcement, and he structured his communication and delegation to minimize exposure. Yet he also recognized that incarceration presented new avenues for influence. By managing relationships with law enforcement, fellow inmates, and intermediaries, Luciano could negotiate privileges, gather intelligence, and even broker strategic alliances that extended his reach beyond prison walls. Every interaction was a calculated move, reinforcing his authority and ensuring that power, though constrained, was never entirely lost. During this period, Luciano's empire continued to generate revenue and influence. Gambling operations, labor rackets, and other enterprises remained active under the supervision of loyal lieutenants, who were instructed to report and defer major decisions to him. He monitored developments, adjusted strategies, and mediated disputes, demonstrating that physical confinement did not equate to a loss of operational oversight. His methods underscored the importance of systems, hierarchy, and disciplined delegation in sustaining power, illustrating that leadership is as much about structure and psychology as it is about direct action. The prison environment also highlighted Luciano's adaptability. He learned to wield influence in contexts very different from the streets, navigating interactions with officials, other inmates, and guards to maintain privilege, security, and operational capability. This adaptability reinforced his reputation for ingenuity and strategic foresight. He could control outcomes in complex and constrained environments, leveraging relationships, perception, and information to maintain authority. The ability to exercise power under such limitations further cemented his legacy as a master strategist whose control transcended circumstance. Psychologically, Luciano's time behind bars tested both his resilience and his capacity for long-term planning. He faced isolation, the threat of betrayal, and the limitations imposed by incarceration, yet he remained focused on maintaining his empire and preparing for eventual release or further negotiation. This period demonstrated that true power is enduring, rooted in systems, perception, and relationships rather than mere physical domination. By projecting influence, rewarding loyalty, and punishing defiance, Luciano ensured that the structure he had created remained intact, resilient, and adaptable even in the face of legal and physical constraints. The prison years also reinforced Luciano's reputation within the underworld. Allies and rivals alike recognized that incarceration had not diminished his authority. If anything, it had underscored the sophistication and resilience of the empire he had built. Orders were followed, disputes mediated, and operations continued with remarkable discipline, reflecting the depth of loyalty, fear, and respect that Luciano had cultivated. His ability to maintain control without direct presence elevated him beyond ordinary criminal leadership, demonstrating that strategy, foresight, and psychological mastery could extend power across both physical and social boundaries. By the time of his eventual release and deportation, Luciano had ensured that his empire remained intact and functional. The systems, hierarchies, and networks he had established were capable of sustaining operations in his absence, a testament to his vision and organizational genius. Power behind bars was not a limitation but a testament to the durability and sophistication of his leadership. Luciano's ability to maintain influence under such conditions illustrated that true authority relies not on proximity but on the careful construction of networks, the cultivation of loyalty, and the subtle, persistent exercise of psychological and strategic control. After his release from prison, Lucky Luciano faced a dramatic shift in circumstance that would test both his adaptability and the enduring reach of his influence. Deportation to Italy marked not only a physical removal from the empire he had meticulously built but also a symbolic challenge to his authority. Stripped of direct control over the streets of New York and the operations he had orchestrated for decades, Luciano was confronted with a world in which his decisions could only be executed through proxies, intermediaries, and carefully cultivated networks. Yet even in exile he demonstrated the same strategic foresight, psychological acuity, and capacity for influence that had defined his rise, reshaping the role of a mafia boss into one that extended across borders and transcended physical presence. In Italy, Luciano quickly assessed the political and social landscape, recognizing both limitations and opportunities. Mussolini's regime and local authorities viewed him with suspicion, aware of his notoriety and the potential threat his networks posed. Yet Luciano, ever pragmatic, leveraged diplomacy, charm, and subtle intimidation to navigate these constraints. He maintained connections with his New York associates, using letters, trusted emissaries, and intermediaries to continue overseeing key operations. By carefully balancing visibility with discretion, he ensured that his authority remained intact, even as he adapted to the realities of life in exile. Luciano's global perspective on organized crime became increasingly evident during this period. He understood that influence was not confined to physical presence. It could be extended through strategic partnerships, information networks, and the cultivation of loyalty. He monitored operations across multiple territories, mediated disputes, and coordinated collaborations between criminal factions in different countries. His ability to maintain authority at a distance highlighted the sophistication of the systems he had built, emphasizing that power could be projected through structure, communication, and psychological influence as effectively as through physical control. Exile also provided Luciano with the space to reflect on his life, his strategies, and the philosophy that had guided his rise. Removed from the immediate pressures of New York streets, he could observe the outcomes of his decisions with clarity, evaluating both successes and failures. He understood that the mafia was not merely a collection of men and money, but a dynamic system of human behavior, loyalty, and perception. This reflection informed his ongoing strategies, allowing him to refine approaches to alliances, conflict resolution, and influence, ensuring that even in exile his guidance shaped the course of the organization he had founded. The personal dimension of exile was also significant. Luciano faced isolation from the world he had dominated, separated from familiar territories, colleagues, and social structures. Yet he approached this challenge with pragmatism, adapting to new cultural, political, and social realities while maintaining the networks and influence that mattered most. His psychological resilience was a defining trait, enabling him to remain a central figure in organized crime despite physical and geographical limitations. By cultivating loyalty, exerting subtle influence, and leveraging strategic insight, Luciano transformed exile from a constraint into a stage for continued power projection. During this period, Luciano also engaged in negotiations and collaborations that extended his influence beyond traditional mafia operations. He participated in intelligence and logistical coordination during World War II, working with Allied authorities to facilitate operations in Italy and the Mediterranean. While controversial, these activities showcased his ability to operate strategically in complex geopolitical contexts, blending pragmatism, diplomacy, and calculated risk. Luciano's involvement in wartime logistics reflected his adaptability and reinforced the idea that power could be exercised indirectly, through networks, leverage, and the management of resources rather than direct confrontation. Even as he aged and faced health challenges, Luciano remained a figure of authority, maintaining influence over his New York organization through trusted lieutenants and intermediaries. He continued to monitor operations, broker alliances, and enforce strategic decisions, ensuring the stability and profitability of the empire he had founded. His exile demonstrated that leadership was not defined by proximity, but by vision, structure, and the ability to shape outcomes through influence and perception. Luciano's capacity to operate across borders, cultures, and political landscapes highlighted his enduring strategic genius. By the end of his life, Luciano had transformed the Mafia into a transnational enterprise capable of surviving the absence of its founder, demonstrating the resilience and foresight of the systems he had constructed. Exile had not diminished his authority; rather, it underscored the sophistication, adaptability, and psychological acuity that had characterized his entire career. He remained a central figure whose guidance and strategic decisions continued to influence operations, alliances, and the broader structure of organized crime. Luciano's final years were a study in the endurance of influence and the capacity for strategic adaptation. While removed from direct control of his original empire, he continued to shape the direction of organized crime, demonstrating that true power relies on vision, networks, and psychological mastery as much as physical presence. Exile highlighted both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of even the most carefully constructed criminal organizations, emphasizing that leadership, when executed with intelligence, foresight, and disciplined control, can transcend geography, circumstance, and the passage of time. Ultimately, Luciano's exile and endgame illustrate the duality of his life: a man who rose through violence, cunning, and ambition, yet whose greatest victories lay in the systems, structures, and influence he left behind. Even in physical absence, he remained a central figure in the underworld, a testament to the enduring power of strategy, perception, and psychological mastery. His ability to navigate exile with foresight, adaptability, and authority solidified his legacy as not merely a powerful criminal, but as the architect of modern organized crime whose influence resonated globally long after he left the streets of New York behind. Lucky Luciano's life was a study in contrasts, a man of ambition and brutality, strategy and instinct, myth and reality. From the crowded streets of New York to the pinnacle of organized crime, he reshaped the underworld, leaving a blueprint for power that would endure long after his death. His innovations in structure, alliances, and strategy turned chaos into order, transforming gangs into disciplined enterprises. Yet behind the legend he remained human, flawed, calculating, and constantly balancing risk and reward. Luciano's legacy is both cautionary and awe-inspiring, reminding us that power can be forged through vision and intelligence as much as through fear. He changed the rules of the game forever, leaving an indelible mark on history, crime, and the psychology of leadership. The man, the myth, and the empire he built continue to captivate and haunt generations,